My successful son refused $3,500 for my cancer surgery. My struggling daughter gave me everything. My son looked at me across his granite kitchen island, the one that alone probably cost more than what I was asking for, and told me he wasn't in a position to help with my surgery. 2 days later, my daughter, who was 3 months behind on her own rent, handed me an envelope with every dollar of her savings inside. My name is Patricia, and I'm 66 years old. I raised 2 children mostly on my own after their father left when they were young, working as a school cafeteria supervisor for over 25 years, a job that never paid much but that I loved because it let me be present for my kids in ways a lot of working parents couldn't manage. My son, Marcus, and my daughter, Renee, grew up in the same house, ate the same simple dinners, wore the same second-hand clothes I stretched every paycheck to afford. But somewhere along the way, as adults, they became almost unrecognizable as siblings raised by the same values. Marcus went to college on a partial scholarship, studied finance, and built a genuinely impressive career, eventually becoming a regional director at an investment firm, earning a salary that let him buy a house in the nicest part of town, the kind of house with a 3-car garage and a kitchen island made of imported granite. Renee took a different path, working as a home healthcare aide, a job that paid barely enough to cover her modest apartment and her son's expenses. My grandson, a sweet 8-year-old named Tyler, whom she was raising alone after his father disappeared from their lives years ago. I never played favorites growing up, or at least I tried desperately not to, but I'll admit, watching Marcus's success unfold over the years filled me with a particular kind of pride that I probably expressed more openly than I should have, bragging to friends about his promotions, his new house, his growing investment portfolio. Renee, meanwhile, quietly worked 12-hour shifts caring for elderly patients, raised her son with patience and warmth despite exhaustion that showed permanently in the circles under her eyes, and never once asked me for anything, even when I suspected she was struggling more than she let on. Everything changed 6 months ago, when a routine mammogram led to a biopsy, and the biopsy led to a diagnosis I never expected to hear directed at me. Stage 2 breast cancer, treatable according to my oncologist, but requiring surgery followed by a course of chemotherapy that would stretch across several difficult months. I remember sitting in that sterile exam room, absorbing news that reorganized my entire understanding of my own mortality, feeling strangely calm on the surface while something inside me quietly cracked apart. My insurance covered a significant portion of the surgical costs, but between deductibles, specialist fees, and expenses related to a specific surgical technique my doctor recommended for better long-term outcomes, I was left needing to cover $3,500 out of pocket within a tight time frame before my scheduled surgery date. On my modest pension and Social Security, that amount felt impossibly out of reach, and after exhausting my own limited savings and selling a few pieces of jewelry that held more sentimental than monetary value, I still fell short by exactly that $3,500. I called Marcus first, not because I doubted Renee's love for me, but because I genuinely believed, given his financial success, that this request would barely register as an inconvenience for him. I remember rehearsing what I would say in the car before I even called, trying to sound calm and matter-of-fact rather than desperate, though desperation was exactly what I felt underneath that careful composure. "Marcus, honey, I need to talk to you about something important," I said when he answered, and I explained the diagnosis, the surgery, the exact amount I needed, and why. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I actually thought the call had dropped. "Mom, that's a lot to process," he finally said. "I'm really sorry you're going through this. But can we talk about the money part in person? I've got a lot going on financially right now that you probably don't fully understand." I agreed, cautiously optimistic, and drove to his house 2 days later for what I assumed would be a brief, generous conversation. Instead, I found myself sitting across that granite island while Marcus explained, with the careful, rehearsed tone of someone justifying a business decision rather than responding to his mother's cancer diagnosis, why he wasn't in a position to help. "Mom, I know this sounds bad, but Jennifer and I just closed on the lake house last month, and our monthly obligations are honestly pretty stretched right now. I've got the mortgage here, the new property, private school tuition for the twins starting in the fall. I wish I could just write you a check, I really do, but $3,500 isn't exactly pocket change for us right now, even though I know it probably looks that way from the outside." I sat there, absorbing his words, feeling something hollow open up inside my chest that had nothing to do with the cancer itself. "Marcus, this is surgery. This is my life we're talking about, not a vacation or a luxury purchase." He had the decency to look uncomfortable, at least, shifting in his expensive kitchen chair, avoiding my eyes. "I know, Mom, and I feel terrible about it. Maybe you could look into a payment plan with the hospital, or see if there's some kind of financial assistance program. I just can't justify pulling that much cash right now, not with everything we've got going on." I left his house that afternoon in a fog of hurt and disbelief, driving home with tears blurring my vision at several points, forcing myself to pull over twice because I couldn't safely see the road. The son I had sacrificed for, stretched every paycheck for, driven 45 minutes each way twice a week during his college years just to bring him home-cooked meals because dorm food upset his stomach, had just told me my cancer surgery wasn't in his budget, while simultaneously describing a lake house purchase that likely cost more than I'd earned across an entire decade of cafeteria work. I didn't call Renee right away. Some part of me, exhausted and humiliated, wanted to absorb Marcus's rejection privately before facing anyone else, even my own daughter. But 2 days later, Renee called me, her voice immediately concerned, because apparently Marcus had mentioned my diagnosis to their aunt at some family gathering I hadn't been invited to, and word had eventually reached her second-hand rather than from me directly. "Mom, why didn't you tell me yourself? I had to hear about this from Aunt Carol, of all people." Her voice cracked with a hurt that mirrored my own, and I found myself apologizing, explaining that I hadn't wanted to burden her given everything she was already managing with Tyler and her demanding work schedule. "Burden me? Mom, you're my mother. This isn't a burden, this is exactly what family is for." She insisted on driving over immediately, and within an hour, she was sitting in my living room, holding my hand, asking detailed questions about the surgery, the recovery timeline, what she could do to help with Tyler's schedule while I recovered. When I finally, reluctantly, mentioned the $3,500 shortfall, and admitted, with considerable shame, that Marcus had declined to help, Renee's expression shifted into something fierce and immediate. "How much do you still need exactly?" "Renee, I wasn't asking you for money. I know things are tight for you and Tyler right now. I just needed to explain why I've been so stressed." She didn't respond to that directly. Instead, 2 days later, she showed up at my door with an envelope, and inside was $3,500 in cash, money I later learned represented every single dollar of savings she'd accumulated over 3 years of careful budgeting, money she had been setting aside specifically for a reliable used car to replace the one that kept breaking down on her during winter mornings, forcing her to sometimes walk Tyler to school in freezing temperatures rather than risk the unreliable engine. "Renee, I can't accept this. This is your car fund. You've told me for months how badly you need a dependable vehicle." She pressed the envelope firmly into my hands, her eyes wet but her voice steady. "Mom, I can walk to work if I absolutely have to. I cannot walk through a world where something happens to you during surgery because we couldn't come up with $3,500. This isn't even a decision for me. This is just what you do for people you love." I broke down completely in that moment, sobbing in a way I hadn't allowed myself since the initial diagnosis, overwhelmed by the stark, painful contrast between my 2 children, one who possessed every material advantage and still calculated cancer surgery against a lake house purchase, and one who possessed almost nothing extra and gave without a single moment of hesitation. The surgery happened 3 weeks later, successful according to my surgical team, clean margins, no evidence of the cancer spreading beyond what they removed. Renee took unpaid time off work to stay with me during recovery, arranging for Tyler to stay with a friend from school for a few days so she could focus entirely on my care, cooking simple meals, helping me manage medications, sitting with me through the disorientation and pain of those first difficult days post-surgery. Marcus, notably, visited exactly once during my entire recovery period, staying less than 30 minutes, bringing an expensive fruit basket that felt, given everything that had happened, almost insulting in its performative generosity. He asked how I was feeling, made brief small talk, and left quickly, citing an important work call he needed to take. About 6 weeks into my recovery, still processing the emotional weight of everything that had unfolded, I received an unexpected call from Marcus's wife, Jennifer, a woman I had always found polite but somewhat distant during family gatherings. Her voice carried a tension I'd rarely heard from her before. "Patricia, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll understand why I'm calling instead of Marcus." She explained, carefully and with obvious discomfort, that Marcus's claim about being financially stretched had been, to put it generously, significantly exaggerated. The lake house purchase had indeed happened, but it had been funded largely through a substantial year-end bonus Marcus received from his firm, a bonus that, according to Jennifer, exceeded $80,000, money that comfortably covered the property's down payment with tens of thousands left over sitting untouched in their investment accounts. "He told you he couldn't help because he genuinely didn't want to," Jennifer said quietly. "Not because he couldn't. I've been so uncomfortable with how he handled this that I couldn't stay silent any longer. I know that's not my place to say, but you deserve to know the truth." I sat with that revelation for a long moment after hanging up, feeling a complicated mixture of anger and heartbreak settle over me. My son hadn't simply been unable to help his mother through cancer surgery. He had chosen, deliberately and with full financial capacity, to prioritize an already comfortable lifestyle over his own mother's medical crisis, and then constructed a convenient narrative about financial strain to avoid confronting the uncomfortable truth of that choice. I decided I needed to speak with Marcus directly, not out of a desire for dramatic confrontation, but because I felt I deserved honesty after everything that had happened. I invited him to my house for what I described simply as a conversation, and when he arrived, I told him plainly what Jennifer had shared with me. His face went through several transformations: surprise, then something like anger directed, absurdly, at his own wife for breaking their apparent unspoken agreement, and finally something closer to genuine shame. "Mom, it's complicated. Jennifer and I had specific financial goals we were working toward, and I guess I just felt like if I started dipping into that bonus for other things, it would set a precedent, you know, other people asking for help too." "Other people, Marcus? I'm not other people. I'm your mother, facing cancer surgery, and you let me believe you simply couldn't afford $3,500 while sitting on tens of thousands in an investment account." He didn't have a good answer for that, because there wasn't one. I told him, as gently as I could manage given the depth of hurt I was still processing, that I needed some space from him, not permanently, not out of spite, but because I needed time to understand how to move forward with a son who had shown me, so clearly, where his priorities actually stood when it mattered most. In the months since, my relationship with Marcus remained strained, occasional stilted phone calls, holiday visits that feel obligatory rather than warm. I don't know if that will ever fully heal, and honestly, I've made peace with the possibility that it might not completely. But my relationship with Renee has deepened into something I treasure more than I can adequately express. I insisted, once I was back on my feet financially, on repaying every dollar of that $3,500, plus enough additional to finally get her that reliable car she'd been saving for, watching her face light up with a joy that had nothing to do with material things and everything to do with finally feeling like the universe had returned even a fraction of what she so freely gave. I spend most weekends now at Renee's small apartment, helping Tyler with his homework, cooking dinners together in her modest but warm kitchen, surrounded by a kind of love that never once calculated its own cost. Cancer taught me many hard lessons this past year, but perhaps the hardest and most valuable was this: the size of someone's bank account tells you nothing about the size of their heart, and sometimes the family members with the least to give are the ones who teach us what love actually looks like when it matters most.